What if a government didn't collapse because it lost a war, lost a capital city, or suffered a dramatic military defeat? What if the real breaking point arrived much more quietly? Not on a battlefield, not at a negotiating table, not during a televised surrender, but inside an office where officials stared at financial reports, budget projections, and payment schedules and realized that the system supporting everything around them was running out of time. Throughout modern history, powerful states have survived military setbacks, economic sanctions, political crises, and even periods of domestic unrest. What often matters most is not the crisis itself, but whether the institutions of government still possess the resources needed to function. And that is why some analysts believe the most important story inside Iran today may not be military. It may be financial. For decades, the Islamic Republic relied on a simple formula. Energy exports generated revenue. Revenue funded government operations. Government operations maintained political stability, security institutions, public services, and the broader network of relationships that kept the system functioning. As long as that cycle continued, many other problems could be managed. But when major revenue streams come under pressure, the challenge becomes much larger than economics. It becomes a question of sustainability. Recent economic reports, sanctions pressure, currency instability, inflation, and declining export flexibility have all intensified concerns about the long-term financial health of the Iranian state. Inflation has become one of the most visible symptoms. Prices for everyday necessities have risen dramatically in recent years. For ordinary families, abstract economic statistics eventually become very practical realities. Food rent, fuel, electricity, medicine. When these essentials become increasingly difficult to afford, economic stress transforms into political pressure. And political pressure has a unique characteristic. Unlike military pressure, it cannot always be contained through traditional security measures. Because it exists everywhere at once. In workplaces, in neighborhoods, in households, in conversations that never appear on television. This is where many analysts believe the real strategic challenge begins. Governments do not operate through ideology alone. Every state, regardless of its political system, depends on institutions. Civil servants must be paid. Infrastructure must be maintained. Security organizations require funding. Retirement systems require funding. Public services require funding. When financial pressure becomes severe enough, the challenge is no longer growth. The challenge becomes preservation. Maintaining existing structures becomes more difficult with every passing month. And maintaining loyalty becomes even harder. Throughout history, governments facing major financial strain often discover that institutional cohesion depends on more than political messaging. It depends on confidence. Confidence that salaries will arrive. Confidence that pensions will be paid. Confidence that tomorrow will look better than today. When that confidence weakens, people begin making different calculations. Not ideological calculations. Personal calculations. Families ask how to protect their future. Businesses ask how to survive uncertainty. Government employees ask whether existing systems will continue functioning. Investors ask whether risks are increasing. Every one of these questions may seem small individually. Together, they can reshape an entire political environment. This is particularly important when discussing large security institutions. Military organizations are often viewed as purely political instruments. In reality, they are also massive administrative systems. They require logistics, maintenance, fuel, housing, training, medical support, equipment replacement, and above all, predictable funding. Modern military power is expensive. Sustaining it over time is even more expensive. Analysts frequently focus on weapons inventories, missile stockpiles, aircraft fleets, and defense capabilities. But military readiness often depends on something much less dramatic: budget stability. Because every piece of equipment eventually depends on someone being paid to operate it, maintain it, repair it, and support it. Without that foundation, even large organizations begin experiencing strain. This is why economic indicators are receiving increasing attention from observers studying Iran's future. Not because economics alone determines political outcomes, but because economics affects nearly every other variable. It affects public confidence. It affects institutional effectiveness. It affects security planning. It affects diplomatic flexibility. And perhaps most importantly, it affects time. A government under financial pressure can still survive. The question becomes how long that pressure can be sustained before larger adjustments become necessary. Historically, states facing similar situations often attempt multiple solutions simultaneously. Some pursue negotiations. Some pursue reforms. Some seek new economic partnerships. Some attempt to increase domestic production. Others focus on strengthening political control while waiting for external conditions to improve. The challenge is that all of these strategies require resources. and resources become harder to generate when economic conditions continue deteriorating. That reality creates a difficult strategic environment, one where every decision carries costs. Every delay creates new risks, and every month matters more than the last. Today, the debate surrounding Iran increasingly centers on this question, not whether challenges exist. Few observers dispute that. The real question is whether existing institutions can adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. Because history repeatedly shows that systems rarely collapse overnight. They weaken gradually, one pressure point at a time, one financial problem at a time, one institutional challenge at a time, until eventually the conversation is no longer about managing a crisis. It becomes about managing transformation. And that may be the most important question facing Iran today. Not whether pressure exists, but whether the current system can successfully adjust before that pressure reshapes the political landscape entirely. But financial pressure alone rarely determines the future of a government. What matters is how that pressure interacts with every other challenge unfolding at the same time. And that is where Iran's strategic picture becomes considerably more complex. While economic conditions continue attracting international attention, the government is also managing regional security concerns, diplomatic negotiations, domestic political expectations, and long-term questions surrounding its energy sector and defense posture. None of these issues exists in isolation. Each one affects the others. This creates what military planners often describe as a multi-domain pressure environment where economic, political, military, and social challenges reinforce one another instead of remaining separate. For policymakers, that creates an increasingly difficult balancing act. Resources devoted to one priority cannot always be devoted elsewhere. Economic stabilization requires funding. Defense modernization requires funding. Infrastructure requires funding. Public services require funding. Every major decision becomes a question of prioritations, and prioritations inevitably create winners and losers. This dynamic has appeared repeatedly throughout modern history. Large political systems rarely disappear because of one decisive event. More often, they experience a gradual accumulation of pressures that slowly reduce their flexibility. As options become fewer, every decision carries greater consequences. History offers numerous examples. The Soviet Union faced years of growing economic strain before its political system unraveled. Other governments have experienced similar patterns in which financial weakness gradually limited military readiness, reduced political flexibility, and increased domestic dissatisfaction long before any formal political transition occurred. The specific circumstances differ in every country. The underlying mechanics often do not. Confidence slowly declines. Institutions become increasingly cautious. Decision-making becomes more centralized. Reform becomes harder. Adaptation becomes slower. Meanwhile, external pressure continues. This does not necessarily mean collapse is inevitable. It simply means the margin for error becomes much smaller. That is the strategic question surrounding Iran today. Can the current system successfully adapt to prolonged financial constraints while simultaneously managing regional security challenges and domestic expectations? Or will multiple pressures eventually reinforce one another in ways that become increasingly difficult to control? International negotiations remain one possible avenue for reducing some of those pressures. Diplomatic engagement has the potential to influence sanctions, trade opportunities, and energy exports. However, diplomacy is rarely determined by economics alone. Security concerns, regional competition, nuclear policy, and broader geopolitical rivalries all influence the pace and outcome of negotiations. Even if agreements are reached, rebuilding economic confidence takes time. Businesses need stability. Investors require predictability. Energy markets respond gradually. Currency confidence is not restored overnight. In other words, financial recovery, if it occurs, is almost always slower than financial decline. That time gap matters, because governments must continue functioning while waiting for improvements to materialize. For ordinary citizens, the timeline often feels even longer. Economic hardship is experienced daily, while policy adjustments may take months or years before producing measurable results. This difference between political timelines and public expectations has historically been one of the greatest challenges facing governments under economic pressure. Another important factor is demographics. Iran possesses a relatively young, educated, and highly connected population. Access to digital communication, global information, and international economic comparisons has fundamentally changed how younger generations evaluate economic opportunities and political performance. Expectations evolve faster than institutions sometimes do. That creates additional pressure for modernization, reform, or structural adjustment. Meanwhile, regional dynamics continue evolving. Energy markets remain sensitive. Shipping routes remain strategically important. Neighboring countries continue adjusting their own security planning. Global powers remain deeply invested in maintaining stability across the broader Middle East because disruptions there extend far beyond regional politics. Energy prices, global supply chains, financial markets, international shipping, all are connected. For that reason, developments inside Iran are no longer viewed simply as domestic issues. They increasingly influence wider strategic calculations across Europe, Asia, and North America. This explains why analysts today spend as much time studying budgets, inflation, industrial output, and fiscal policy as they do studying missile inventories or military exercises. Economic resilience has become a strategic variable, not separate from national security. Part of it, perhaps the most important lesson from history, is that transformation rarely announces itself clearly. Looking backward, historians often identify obvious turning points. Living through those moments feels very different. People rarely recognize them in real time. Instead, change appears as a series of seemingly unrelated developments. An economic report, a policy adjustment, a diplomatic delay, a decline in investment, a shortage in one sector that gradually spreads into another. Only later does the broader pattern become visible. That is why today's situation deserves careful observation rather than dramatic conclusions. There are several possible paths forward. The first is gradual stabilization, where negotiations ease external pressure, economic conditions slowly improve, and institutions successfully adapt to a more constrained environment. The second is prolonged stagnation, in which financial pressures continue without producing either rapid recovery or rapid deterioration, leaving the country in an extended period of uncertainty. The third possibility involves significant political or institutional reform driven by economic necessity rather than ideological change. History shows that prolonged financial pressure often forces governments to reconsider policies that once appeared permanent. Finally, there is the possibility that multiple pressures begin reinforcing one another faster than policymakers can respond, creating a period of accelerated political transformation whose direction becomes increasingly difficult to predict. Which of these outcomes ultimately emerges will depend on decisions made not only inside Iran, but also in Washington, Brussels, Moscow, Beijing, and throughout the broader Middle East. Diplomatic negotiations, energy markets, regional security, domestic economic policy, international investment, all remain interconnected. That is why understanding Iran today requires looking beyond headlines focused on missiles, military deployments, or isolated political events. The deeper story may be unfolding inside ministries, financial institutions, industrial sectors, and household budgets. Because throughout history, the durability of governments has often depended less on dramatic moments than on whether their institutions could continue performing the ordinary functions that keep a nation operating every single day. The coming months will reveal whether Iran's current challenges represent another difficult chapter in a long history of resilience or the beginning of a more fundamental transformation. Whatever the outcome, one reality is already clear. The decisions made now will shape not only Iran's future, but also the strategic balance of the Middle East and the global energy system for years to come. That is why this story deserves attention, not because every prediction will prove correct, but because the forces now shaping Iran are larger than any single headline, military operation, or diplomatic meeting. They represent the intersection of economics, strategy, governance, and geopolitics. And history has repeatedly shown that when those forces begin moving together, the consequences rarely remain confined within one country's borders.